So my name is Sean Willits. I'm the manager of ConocoPhillips Remediation and Risk Management Group, and I'm not going to speak to you for very long today, so you can be thankful for that. Today's speaker, Mr. Earle Gray, attended our department offsite yesterday, where he described for us how Canada gave birth to the modern petroleum industry and how the events in Turner Valley led to the creation of the ERCB, or as it's now known, the Alberta Energy Regulator. So two things struck me about his presentation. Almost 200 years ago, the petroleum industry started with bitumen. And today we are back chasing bitumen to turn into oil, so we've come full cycle. And the other thing is that almost 100 years ago, the activities in Turner Valley from a company named Royalite and others, and for those of you who don't know it, Royalite is actually, it's us, it's ConocoPhillips today. We still have liabilities out there that we're dealing with that originated over 100 years ago. So Earle Gray began writing about oil and gas in 1951 as a neophyte reporter with the Calgary Albertan newspaper. He was managing editor of Oil Week magazine from 1955 to 1964, and he was an editor from 1964 to 1971. For the next 7 years, he was director of public affairs for the Canadian Arctic Gas Consortium, and since 1977, he's been engaged as a speechwriter, editorial consultant, publisher, and writer. He is the author of 10 published non-fiction books, including 7 dealing with the history of the Canadian petroleum industry. Earle holds a number of writing awards, a Lifetime Achievement Award from the Petroleum History Society of Canada, and in 2008, he became one of only 2 Canadian recipients of the Samuel T. Pease Award from the U.S. Petroleum History Institute. He is currently working on his 11th and most ambitious book, Fossil Fire, A Social History of the Fuels that Empower and Imperil, and it deals with the coal, oil, and gas industries from the time of the Industrial Revolution. Please join me in welcoming Mr. Earle Gray.
Thank you, Sean, for that kind introduction. I must tell you that outside of the oil patch, I'm probably best known as one of those famous authors that no one has ever heard of. I feel very honored to see such a large turnout, very privileged. When I started writing about oil and gas for the Calgary Albertan newspaper in 1951, one of my first assignments was to cover public hearings of applications by TransCanada Pipelines and others who wanted to build pipelines to send Alberta gas across Canada and into the United States. The applicants, of course, claimed that Alberta had a large surplus of gas, and those who opposed the applications argued otherwise. An opposing witness who sought to counter the evidence of another expert who had predicted that Albertans would soon have gas flowing out of their ears. What was flowing out of their ears, lawyer Paddy Nolan asked in cross-examination. Gas, replied the witness. I have known it, responded Nolan, to flow from other orifices. Incidentally, that's more than just a myth of memory. I actually found that quotation in the transcript of the hearings, going through thousands of pages of transcripts for one of my other books. Well, enough reminiscing. My job here is to talk about Canada's role in the birth of the oil industry, and secondly, how the Turner Valley oil field made Alberta a leader in petroleum conservation and sustainable development. We will start with Abraham Gessner of Nova Scotia, doctor, geologist, chemist, inventor, author, lecturer, and widely acclaimed as the father of the modern petroleum industry by a U.S. organization that claimed that too. It was an effort to rescue some starving horses and make some money that led Gessner on a 40-year quest to develop and commercialize the gas and liquid fuels that he called kerosene. the fuel that would light the lamps of the world for half a century until the development of the electric light bulb by Edison, and it is now, of course, the fuel for jet aircraft. The year is 1816. Gessner is 19. His formal schooling had ended 4 years earlier when he went to work on the family farm on the Bay of Fundy in Nova Scotia. This was the year without summer. Ash from a gigantic eruption of Indonesia's Mount Tambora had clouded and cooled much of the world. Ice lingered into June as far south as Pennsylvania. Crops failed, and in Europe, 200,000 people perished. Hoping to save some hungry horses and make some money, Gessner loaded them on a ship and, working as a deckhand to pay his way, shipped them for sale in the West Indies. He returned home with no money but a large wagon load of fossils, seashells, and other specimens of nature, and buckets of bitumen from Trinidad's Pitch Lake. In a shed behind the farmhouse, he began what he claimed were 2,000 experiments on the use of bitumen as fuel, either gas fuel or oil. A decade later, Gessner is now a married farmer with a growing family, but he apparently spent too much time on his scientific inquiries, and he was in danger of being thrown into debtor's prison when his father-in-law rescued him by sending him to London for 3 years to become a doctor. In London, Gessner he did well in his medical education, but he was also intrigued by the lectures of Charles Lyell, the leading geologist of the time, and he was also intrigued by the gas lights of London, fueled by coal gas, of course. At the time, that was something very new. A friend of the Scottish engineer William Murdoch, who developed the commercial process to produce coal gas, told a delightful story that I'll share with you. The friend had visited Murdoch in his Glasgow workshop, and the two faced a long walk home on a dark night. Mr. Murdoch, the friend wrote, went into the gasworks where he filled a bladder, and placing it under his arm like a bagpipe, he discharged through the stem of an old tobacco pipe a stream of burning gas which enabled us to walk in safety. Returning home, Gessner combined doctoring and geology, riding on his horse through the backwoods of Nova Scotia and Newfoundland to visit isolated farmers. He carried with him his medical bag, a geologist's pick hammer, a bag for any fossils he might find, and a flute to entertain any families that he might be compelled to spend the night with. 3 years after his return from London, he wrote his first book. He was the author of some 20 books and published papers, but his first book was on the geology of Nova Scotia. It was so popular that he was named Nova Scotia's geologist, the first government geologist of a British colony. 3 years later, he was New Brunswick's government geologist. During the first 5 spring to fall sessions of field work, he found a deposit of bitumen in Albert County, which he named Albertite. For his experiments, this was a much better source than the bitumen he had brought back from Trinidad, and large enough to offer some commercial possibilities. Gessner's interest focused at first on the use of bitumen to produce a gas fuel, which he claimed would be a better fuel than coal for gas lighting and heating. Heating bitumen at temperatures below 800 degrees Fahrenheit produced a liquid fuel. At higher temperatures, it produced the gas similar to coal gas. In either case, liquid or gaseous state, distillation was followed by further refining, complicated procedures with acids and alkalines and washing, but it resulted in a fuel that could be burnt without smell or smoke. It also promised to be a much better and cheaper source of lamp fuel than increasingly costly sperm oil from whales, which were in danger of being driven into extinction. Gessner first publicly demonstrated his kerosene during a lecture at Charlottetown, Prince Edward Island in 1846. Little is known about this demonstration other than apparently it was gas that he demonstrated. It may have been oil, but it's not certain. There was only a very brief newspaper item, and it didn't say very much more than the fact that it was attended by a numerous and delighted audience. Gessner, incidentally, was the most popular lecturer in the Maritime Province at a time when public lectures were a big thing. That was a big source of entertainment at that period. There was no televisions, no movies. In 1850, Gessner obtained his first U.S. patent, and it was a patent for manufacture of illuminating gas from bitumen. There was no mention in the patent of manufacturing illuminating gas from coal. That was an omission that would prove very costly to Gessner, as we will see. With his patent in hand, he went to New York to demonstrate a retort that he had designed. There were a number of public demonstrations of his kerosene gas, which he claimed affords the cheapest, safest, and most agreeable light ever used. The demonstrations were favorably reported in newspapers and in such journals as Scientific and American, and Gessner designed his retort to be built small enough to work in a kitchen stove or big enough to work in the retort of, that supplied an entire town with coal gas. It could thus be used in a house, a factory, or the works that supplied an entire town. Gessner appointed his son Henry and a New York firm as agents to license the use of the retort in factories and other buildings for fees of as much as $1 per burner, depending on the number of burners. Unfortunately, it appears that no one purchased a license. If no one would license his retort, Gessner decided to build his own bitumen-fed gasworks to illuminate the city of Halifax. He formed a company, acquired a lease to the albertite bitumen deposit and began to mine it. A rival group, however, acquired a lease to mine the deposit as coal. It was really not coal, but they had a right to mine it as coal. The rival group sent men armed with rifles to chase Gessner's men off the site. Gessner sued, of course, and the issue came to trial in 2 court cases. It was up to the juries to determine if albertite was coal or bitumen, and thus whether Gessner or his rival group held the right to mine the stuff. In the first trial, the jury upheld Gessner's argument. In the second, longer trial, and which cost, it was a lengthy trial with a number of expert witnesses on both sides, half of them saying that this was coal and half of them saying no, it was not coal, it's bitumen. And in that case, Gessner lost. He had spent $30,000 in that case, and that was a large sum in those days. And it was obviously the wrong decision. The albertite bitumen was not coal. Of all his setbacks, this was the one that left Gessner bitter for the rest of his life. Rebuffed in Nova Scotia, Gessner returned to New York City the following year, this time with his family, to take up residence and make one more effort to establish a bitumen-based gas light business. Gessner found financial backing with the help of a 28-year-old ship's broker with the splendid name of Horatio Earle. In March 1853, Earle issued an 8-page prospectus offering for sale $100,000 in shares of a new company that was first called the Asphalt Mining and Kerosene Gas Company. The prospectus noticed that Gessner had been retained as the chief chemist at a modest salary. The focus soon shifted, however, from gas to liquid fuel. 10 months after the prospectus was issued, Gessner had another U.S. patent, this time for a new liquid hydrocarbon, which I denominate kerosene, and which may be used for illuminating and other purposes. The name of the company kept changing, eventually to the North American Kerosene Company, and finally New York Kerosene Oil Company. Best known probably as the North American Kerosene Company. Work on a large plant to refine kerosene, first from bitumen, later from coal, was already underway before this patent was issued. Historian Kendall Beaton of the Shell Oil Company, who has provided the most detailed account of Gessner's New York refinery, claimed that it began operations in the first half of 1854. Other refineries soon sprang up. Coal was soon used in place of bitumen because there wasn't enough bitumen to meet the demand of the growing number of coal oil refining companies. One of the first to follow Gessner's lead was Samuel Downer, a Boston-based supplier of sperm oil and whale candles. Downer built a coal plant using a process developed by his chemist Luther Atwood. But in 1857, Downer acquired a license to use Gessner's process with payments with royalty payments, of course. 4 years after the Gessner plant first began producing operations, the coal oil refining industry hit its peak in the United States. At the end of 1859, there were as many as 70 coal oil plants in the United States, turning out some 23,000 gallons of kerosene every day, mostly based on the refining aspects developed by Gessner. And it was not the distillation that was the key. That was simple and not been known for decades. It was really refining it with acids and alkalines and washing that made it an acceptable fuel. By far the largest and most successful was the refinery designed by Gessner. It accounted for 11% of the output from these 70 plants. But by this time, however, Gessner was gone from the North American Kerosene Company, dismissed from his job and his modest salary. To find out what happened, we have to turn to Scotland, and we'll have to keep track of a few dates if the story is to make sense. In 1850, the year that Gessner first got his patent for the use of bitumen, in Scotland, a chemist, James Young, obtained a British patent to distill oil from coal. His process did not include any extensive refining. It was based on known technology, but the strength of his patent was the fact that he was the first to commercialize it. He did not have any extensive refining operations or nothing like that covered in his patent. For 7 years, Young produced only a lubricating oil and a solvent, but no fuel, using not much more than one pass distillation. In 1852, Young supplemented his British patent by securing a U.S. patent. Thomas Antisel, the government chemist who approved the U.S. patent, described Young's process, and I quote, as a small step in advance of previously applied knowledge, an advance so slight as hardly to have elicited any surprise. Young did not produce a lamp fuel until 1857, 4 years after Gessner's plant was producing it. It was Luther Atwood, Downer's chemist, who showed Young how his lubricating and solvents could be further refined into a passable lamp fuel. Young was aggressive, very aggressive in enforcing his patent, and he had some difficulty in enforcing the legitimacy of his patent. He was rested on a pretty thin reed, and in fact, one witness in some of his trials who had argued that what Young was using initially was bitumen, turned around and said, no, it wasn't bitumen, it was coal. Nevertheless, Young was very aggressive in enforcing his patent, requiring anyone who distilled an oil from coal to pay a royalty of at least 2 cents a gallon, no matter how much they might further refine the oil beyond the distillation process. Those who infringed his patent, paid heavy damages. He cut off sales of solvents to one of his major customers, winning such damage that his former customer was a substantial and well-established Glasgow firm. His former customer was bankrupt. The penalties were so heavy. The number of American coal oil refiners grumbled about having to pay the royalties to Young, but they paid. They didn't want to face the prospect of damages that would break them. Young was on his way to becoming remarkably wealthy, with aggressiveness and tactics that at least raised eyebrows. Gessner was on his way to lost fortune, if not financial ruin, that might well have been averted if his U.S. patents had included the use of coal as well as bitumen. That was an oversight that was very costly for Gessner. Young's enforcement of his patent forced Sam Downer to cancel his arrangement and royalties payable to the North American Kerosene Company, which was facing bankruptcy because they had violated Young's patent. Downer acquired control of the North American Kerosene Company, and Luther Atwood was named chief chemist of both firms, and Gessner was dismissed. Gessner remained in New York for several years, combining his medical practice, a geological consultant, and writing his 1861 landmark book, A Practical Treatise on Coal, Petroleum, and Other Distilled Oils. That book is enough alone to secure Gessner a place in the industry's history. It was the Bible for petroleum refining for about half a century. In ill health, Gessner returned to Halifax in late 1863 and died there the following year, and he was buried in an unmarked grave that remained unmarked for 69 years. Gessner had at least one thing in common with Alberta's best-known humorist, and certainly my favorite humorist, Bob Edwards. In his iconic Calgary Eye-Opener newspaper, Bob Edwards wrote, "If it is true that money talks, the only thing it ever said to me was goodbye." One of Gessner's biographers, however, said it probably better. He wrote, "Had Gessner been willing to confine his restless intellect to farming and doctoring, he might have prospered, but the world would have been poor." The coal oil industry laid the foundation for the oil industry. It created the product, kerosene. It brought forth newly designed lamps to burn the kerosene. It established the refining process. It built a large market just waiting for oil that could be a cheaper source of refining feedstock. All that was needed for the birth of the oil industry was an adequate supply of crude oil, from which kerosene could be produced at much less cost. That supply would come from the far southwest corner of Ontario, then called Canada West. In 1849, a geological survey of Canada identified a bitumen deposit in the swampy, tangled backwoods near Sarnia and caught the attention of Charles Nelson Tripp, a vigorous prospector and promoter. Tripp leased the rights to mine the deposit, organized a company with funds from daring investors, and set out to exploit the deposit. Tripp ignored the advice he received from Thomas Antisel, the former U.S. government patent agent who is now at this time a consultant. Gessner reported that this deposit in Canada West was a very valuable variety of bitumen, suitable for refining into either gas or liquid kerosene. Tripp, however, simply boiled the bitumen into a consistency that made it suitable for paving roads. Tripp's paving material won an honorable mention in Canada's exhibit at the 1855 Universal Exhibition at Paris, and Tripp received a bitumen order to help pave some of the streets of Paris. But none of this prevented him from going bankrupt, and he left Canada to seek his fortune prospecting for mineral wealth in the United States. One of Tripp's creditors was a very well-established Hamilton carriage maker. He made not only wagons, but he made railway carriages and horse-drawn street carriages. The carriage maker was James Miller Williams, who acquired Tripp's property, organized a new company, and set out to distill and refine the bitumen into kerosene. In 1857, Williams had built a refinery at Hamilton and may have produced his first small trial batches of kerosene from bitumen. His raw material, however, would soon change. Williams' workers were digging what was intended to be a water well near the bitumen deposit when, not later than July 1858, they hit what a newspaper said was an inexhaustible supply of oil, great enough to yield not less than $1,000 per day of clear profit. Before the end of September, Williams was selling what the Sarnia Observer described as this most superior illuminating oil for $1 a gallon in Hamilton, where Williams had his refinery, and $1.25 at Sarnia. Williams' firm, the Canadian Oil Company, prospered for nearly a decade before it was merged with other Canadian refineries. Its kerosene was trade name Victoria Oil, and it was sold in Canada, Europe, South America, and Asia. Of course, drillers stampeded to what was soon became known as the Oil Springs discovery near Sarnia, and later a larger nearby Petrolia oil field. And for the rest of the century, Ontario was a significant factor in world production of crude oil and refined kerosene. In August 27, 1858, the oil discovery at Tettlesville, Pennsylvania, said to mark the birth of the American, if not the world petroleum industry, came 13 months after the oil springs discovery in Canada West and the establishment of a fully integrated Canadian industries. But the American oil fields were soon more numerous than those in Canada, and while Canadian production by the world standards at that time was significant, they were soon far outstripped by the production from the American fields. But that didn't start to happen until at least more than a year after the Canadian industry was born. It might appropriately be said that it was Canada that launched the oil industry and the United States that lifted it into orbit. Time now to talk about Turner Valley and its consequences. It seems to me barely feasible that 50 years ago, when I was editor of Oil Week magazine, we turned out this volume to mark the 50th anniversary of the discovery of the Turner Valley oil field. And just 5 weeks from now, we'll be marking the 100th anniversary of the discovery of the Turner Valley oil field. I hope to be there for that occasion. I've been invited and I'm looking forward to it. The Turner Valley story starts with a man who discovered the field. William Stewart Heron had packed enough activity into his 14 years to fill 2 lives when he set out to examine an oil and gas seepage on Sheep Creek southwest of Calgary. Heron had left home at 14 to work in the kitchen of nearby lumbering camps in the Haliburton Highlands of central Ontario. He had worked as a lumberman, a builder of roads and railway beds, a farmer, a rancher in Alberta who rode and broke in wild horses, a hard rock prospector, and a successful speculator in Alberta farmlands. While his formal education was limited, he was a voracious reader and a self-taught geologist who had gone to Pennsylvania to examine that area's oil fields. He spent several days digging into the Sheep Creek seepage. Using ingenious homemade equipment, he filled several vinegar bottles with escaping gas from the seepage, and he sent these to universities in Pennsylvania and California for analysis. When the reports came back that this gas was rich in propane and what was then called naphtha, I think today might be called condensate or pentanes plus, but was then called naphtha. This gas was rich in those byproducts. Heron sold his farm at Okotoks and spent about $40,000 to acquire 7,000 acres of freehold land and government permits along the Turner Valley anticline. But Heron needed more money to drill, and Archibald Dingman, who had drilled for gas with some success, organized Calgary Petroleum Products, financed by such prominent Calgarians as lawyer and future Prime Minister R.B. Bennett and lawyer James Lougheed, future senator and grandfather of Peter Lougheed, the Alberta Premier. The new company and Dingman acquired majority interest in 4,000 of Heron's 7,000 acres of rights. Heron wound up with a modest cash payment, a 20% interest in the company's leases, and 25% of the issued shares of the company. He was the company's largest shareholder and managing director, He selected the first well site. He cut the timber and built the derrick. He hauled in a new cable tool drilling rig with some of his numerous teams of horses. But much to his chagrin, Calgary Petroleum Products No. 1 was commonly known as the Dingman well. As the rig slowly pounded the cable tools through rocks, every whiff of gas it encountered generated a flurry of stock market speculation. When the well struck a little oil on May 14, it unleashed Canada's wildest and most excessive stock market speculation. Crowds filled Calgary's main street, lined up to buy stocks, and scores of putative oil firms that had, most of which had nothing to offer other than a few government leases, some as little as 20 acres. Many of them, perhaps most of them, never ever drilled a well. But the fly-by-night promoters skimmed Calgarians of more than $1 million. One of the companies, of course, that initially seemed to prosper, at least in the stock market price, was Calgary Petroleum Products. Heron, as you might suspect, was a diamond in the rough, and he very much longed to join the social elite of Calgary, to rub elbows with people like lawyers Bennett and lawyers Lougheed and the soft, sophisticated, silver-haired Dingman. So initially, for a short period of time, Heron was flush for money. He bought the largest house he possibly could. He entertained lavishly, but it didn't last long. As 7 months after the discovery well, of course, came the First World War, and the economy turned for the worse. It became apparent that Calgary Petroleum Products had little more than a trickle of oil, and the house that Heron had built or had bought, he was forced to sell for 1/3 of what he paid, and his wife had to take in boarders to help ends meet. And that was really not the status that would bring him into the social elite of Calgary. During the next 6 years after the discovery well, Turner Valley produced only a trickle of oil and some natural gas that was stripped of its naphtha, used as refinery feedstock to produce gasoline. In fact, some of the naphtha went unrefined straight into farm trucks. It was so volatile that the farm trucks of those days could burn it as fuel without any refining. Neither Heron nor Calgary Petroleum Products prospered. The company seemed headed for certain bankruptcy in 1920 when its Turner Valley naphtha stripping gas scrubbing plant was destroyed by fire. The disaster turned into an unexpected bonanza, but not for Calgary Petroleum Products. Imperial Oil acquired the company's properties under a new subsidiary, Royalite Oil Company. Yesterday, Sean pointed out to me that ConocoPhillips, of course, acquired Royalite and acquired associated companies, Gulf Canada, and his predecessor, British American Oil Company. I knew the management of most of those companies, not Royalite so much, but most of the others quite well. Especially I knew very well Jerry McAfee. It took me half a day to remember Jerry's first name, but but don't press me for any more names, because I'm at the same age as the actor David Niven, who kept a diary of his years in his 80s and published that diary under the title of "My Name Escapes Me." Royalite Oil Company built a new scrubbing plant, renamed the company's first wells Royalites number 1, 2, and 3, and 4 years later drilled Royalite number 4 at a depth of 3,740 feet. Royalite 4 struck the large gas cap of the main Turner Valley Reservoir, burning gas at a rate of 20 million cubic feet a day until the well was brought under control. The tilted Mississippian age limestone rock at Turner Valley has a gas cap section at the top, followed by the oil section, followed by water. A common enough petroleum reservoir. At the risk of demonstrating the obvious, consider my arm as the limestone rock formation at Turner Valley. It's tilted. This is a gross oversimplification, and maybe I'm demonstrating the obvious. The gas cap goes up to the top, where it is stopped by an impervious rock, probably caused by a fault. So you have a gas cap here. You have the oil section here, and then you have the water below. Well, for 12 years, when Royalite number 4 found the gas cap, for 12 years nobody knew about the oil section that lay down here, the greater amount of wealth. And during that 12-year period, the wastage of gas from the gas cap was phenomenal. During that 12-year period, dozens of Turner Valley wells produced enormous quantities of gas, which was stripped of naphtha, with most of the residue, nearly all of the residues, burned in giant flares that were said to enable Calgarians on summer evenings to read their newspapers while sitting on their porches. Lack of knowledge about how excessive production rates made it impossible to produce enormous quantities of oil that still remain trapped in thousands of tiny pores and underground rocks in hundreds of fields throughout North America. That flush production was a common practice, but this gas cap stripping, that was pretty unique. Turner Valley was not unique in wasting energy in the early years of the industry. But the loss was enormous. At the peak of that 12-year period, between the discovery of the gas cap and the discovery of the oil column, the flared gas was equivalent to burning 25,000 tons of coal every day. not equivalent in weight, but equivalent in energy. In 1931, it was described as by far the greatest waste of natural gas taking place on the continent. But the flared gas was the least of it. The Turner Valley originally contained trillions of cubic feet of natural gas and 1.1 billion barrels of oil. An estimated 1.8 trillion cubic feet of gas, equivalent to 300 million barrels of oil, was lost by this flaring process during that 12-year period. Far worse was the fact that the flared gas robbed the reservoir pressure needed to produce the oil. Under good conservation practices, Turner Valley should have been capable of producing more than 60% of the oil in that reservoir. Now it is estimated, and this is from a report produced by Sproul Associates 2 years ago. They estimated that enhanced recovery would increase the amount of oil that will ultimately be produced at Turner Valley, will increase it from 12% of the oil in place to 14%. That's all. So instead of recovering 60% or more, only 14% of the oil is now estimated can economically be produced. That's a loss of more than 500 million barrels of oil. And you combine that with the equivalent of the natural gas and the oil equivalent of 300 million barrels of oil. That's a loss of at least 800 million barrels of oil and gas equivalent, maybe 1 billion barrels. That's an enormous loss. It was in response to this enormous waste that in 1838 the Alberta government created the Petroleum and Natural Gas Conservation Board to establish and enforce conservation measures with maximum production allowables for every oil and gas well in the province. These were based on engineering calculations on the maximum rate at which oil could be produced without further impairing the amount that might be recoverable. And that meant most of the Turner Valley oil producers would have to cut back. They would have to produce at lesser rates. And that was they didn't sit very well with a great many of the Turner Valley producers, including Dingman. In fact, the legislation was so controversial that there were fistfights in the Alberta legislature before it was finally passed. But when it was passed, Alberta had a regulatory regime that was probably second to none anywhere. It had in place a regime for sustainable development that endured throughout the period of maximum production of conventional oil, and Alberta was successfully remarkable in capturing economic rewards for citizens, the owners of the resource, in minimizing loss and waste, in encouraging competition in the oil patch with a pro-rationing system that equitably shared market demand on the basis of sustainable development. So when the Leduc discovery came in 1947, Alberta was already well established with a regulatory regime that surpassed many of the oil-producing states in the U.S. One or two may have matched it, but not possibly. Alberta was helped by the fact that the province owned the mineral rights, so that gave them greater opportunity to enforce conservation right. So Turner Valley made Alberta a trendsetter in sustainable development. As for Heron, he said he spent $1 million of his own money trying to develop production in the Turner Valley, and his son said that he died damn poor. Thank you very much.